Today I will be incorporating my first movie into my videos. I will not do this every time, but I will include one when I think it teaches a valuable life lesson that needs to be heard. I think it's only fitting that my first movie will be my favorite movie of all time, Moonlight. Before I get into this review, I want to say that I will be discussing spoilers for this movie, so I highly recommend watching Moonlight before watching this video. It's available on Netflix if you want to watch it. Now, there are so many themes worth talking about when it comes to this movie, and I will definitely talk about Moonlight again in the future, but for today, I will be focusing on what I think is the most important theme, identity, and the struggle to find yourself as you progress in life. In the final scene, after reconnecting for the first time in over a decade, Kevin asks Chiron the most important question of the movie.
Who is you, man?
Who is you is the heart of Moonlight. As we follow the protagonist Chiron throughout his life, we see his great struggle with finding himself and choosing whether he will follow his own path or the one society is forcing him towards. Obviously, it's important to start from the beginning. This movie is divided into 3 distinct acts, and I will mirror that with this video. We will begin with Chiron's childhood. This movie begins when Juan discovers Chiron in an abandoned apartment. Chiron is shy and doesn't really respond to Juan's questions. Juan then takes him out for lunch, but fails in getting anything out of Chiron. Eventually, Juan takes him back to his house, and with help of his girlfriend Teresa, Chiron begins to open up. He reveals his name, but says that most people call him by his nickname, Little, which is what the first act of this movie is called as well. Teresa expresses her distaste for the nickname and chooses to call him by his real name. And she's right, the nickname doesn't really have a positive connotation. It was given to Chiron because he is smaller and softer than most of his peers. And while you could argue that this is just children teasing, I don't think that Chiron is proud to be called Little. And this is the first example of society forcing an identity upon Chiron. Unfortunately, Chiron does not have a good family life. With no father and a mother struggling with drug addiction, Chiron is forced to navigate most of life on his own. However, as the audience, we see that Juan is about to become a father figure in Chiron's life, and it's clear that Chiron takes a liking to him even without verbally saying it. We see, following this first interaction, that Chiron voluntarily comes back to Juan's house on his own. And after this, we get one of the most important scenes in the movie. So, Chiron and Juan go to the beach, and Juan teaches Chiron how to swim. And in this scene, we see Chiron at his most vulnerable, scared of the water, but not too afraid to face it with Juan's help. And in my eyes, this is Chiron's place of discovery, where he first begins his journey of finding his true self. And this is primarily credited to Juan, who following their time in the ocean gives Chiron some extremely important life advice.
At some point, you gotta decide for yourself who you're gonna be. Can't let nobody make that decision for you.
Juan's advice will echo throughout the entire movie, and we will constantly look back to his words as Chiron grows older. You could tell that Juan has ignited something in Chiron. As he's starting his path to discovery, he realizes that some aspects of his identity are not the norm in his world, the main one being his sexuality. It is unfortunate to see that at such an early age, Chiron knows that being gay is not the right thing to be in his society. In addition to his own character, Chiron even asks some tough questions that challenge Juan's identity. Now, even though we know Juan is a good person through his time with Chiron and the way he treats him, Juan is a drug dealer, and you could see that Juan is upset to admit that to Chiron. And seeing this reaction to admitting this to Chiron made me realize why Juan chose to become so involved with Chiron in the first place. He knows that Chiron could one day turn into him, but he doesn't want that. He wants Chiron to discover who he really is because maybe he never got to. But will Chiron succeed? We'll have to find out. We jump forward to Chiron's teenage years, which were proved to be his most formative. Now, at this point, Chiron is still quiet and rarely talks in school. You can see that he is still struggling with accepting himself and forming his identity. This act of the movie is titled Chiron, and in my opinion, this was done to symbolize the period of Chiron's life where he has to decide who Chiron is. And you might think this does not make sense because he is Chiron, but the problem is that Chiron is at a crossroads right now. He's faced with 2 different paths he could follow to fully establish his identity. To be more specific, these 2 paths are directly related to masculinity, or what it means to be a man in Chiron's world. Simply put, the ideal man in his society is hard, and anything not connected to that view is considered soft. Throughout this act, we see that Chiron is lost, with no one to turn to for advice. Chiron's family situation is not improved, but even worse, Juan has passed away. It's interesting to note that the death is off screen and is only brought up in one line when 2 kids are bullying Chiron. This was my one criticism of the movie. I wish we got something from Chiron directly talking about how this affected him, but I understand why it was left out because this would not be something that Chiron would normally do. However, there is another figure that emerges who will prove to be important in helping Chiron on his path to discovery, Kevin. When we see Kevin and Chiron talk after school, it is clear that Chiron is more comfortable around him than he is around most people. Now we again see them accidentally run into each other at the beach, and what follows is one of the most significant moments in Chiron's life. As they talk more, we see Chiron open up more than he probably ever has in his life to anyone. Eventually, Chiron and Kevin share an intimate moment, and then Kevin drives Chiron home. Like Act 1, we see Chiron at his most vulnerable by the ocean. But these vulnerable moments are where you truly find yourself, and with Kevin's help, Chiron did. And for the first time in the movie, you could see that Chiron is actually happy. This is who he wants to be. Unfortunately, society will intervene the following day. At lunch the next day, Kevin and Terrell, a kid who bullies Chiron, talk about an old game where someone would be chosen to get beat up. This game is obviously designed to show people who is hard and who is soft. Terrell scans the crowd for somebody to pick for Kevin, and unfortunately he chooses Chiron. Now Kevin is faced with a decision: refuse and probably be labeled soft, or even get beaten up himself, or be hard and beat up Chiron. And Kevin chooses the second option. And in the process of beating up Chiron, Kevin destroyed the person he was helping to guide. Now I want to put Juan and Kevin up against each other, and you can see there's a clear difference between how they affect Chiron. Imagine if after guiding Chiron, Juan had brought him to where he sells drugs. It would have completely ruined his lesson. Unfortunately, this is where Kevin failed. He forced Chiron to pick which identity he would create, only it wasn't the one he was meant to be. Without the presence of Juan, Chiron has no one to turn to and makes his choice. The final act of the movie deals with the consequences of that action.
Why'd you call me? You played this song, man.
In the third and final act of the movie, Chiron is now an adult and has built himself up to be hard. Instead of accepting who he was and creating his own identity, Chiron pushed that side of him away and created a new version of himself, the ideal man in his society, someone like Juan. However, I'm certain that Juan would have never wanted this. He took care of Chiron in the first place in order to prevent this from happening, but unfortunately society intervened. Every actor is great in this movie, but I really want to highlight Trevante Rhodes, who plays this version of Chiron. Just with his facial expressions and body language alone, you can see that Chiron is distant and fragmented as an individual. While we see Chiron act intimidating to the people around him, there's just something missing from him now. However, all this changes when he gets a call from Kevin, who he has not spoken to in a decade. The conversation is short, but Kevin lets Chiron know that he would like to cook him something at the diner he works at if he ever is in the neighborhood. It's important to note that this was not exactly an immediate invitation. Kevin was not asking Chiron to drive there the next day, but he did. Now Chiron, while he may not say it, wants help, and by going to see Kevin is starting down a path of rediscovery. But before reaching Kevin, Chiron visits a recovery center where his mother stays. You can tell that he has not seen her in a long time, and there is a lot of resentment built up in Chiron against his mother for not helping him as a child. However, it seems that by the end of their talk, Chiron has much less hate for his mother and continues on his drive to see Kevin. Upon entering the diner, Chiron changes drastically. The person that he built up vanishes, and when he sees Kevin, there is almost a complete reversion back to his old self. They sit and begin to have a cordial conversation, while Kevin brings Chiron his promised dinner. However, there is a turn when Chiron reveals what he does to Kevin. Kevin is both surprised and angry, and he realizes that the Chiron he once knew has been buried down. Returning the favor of the meal, Chiron gives Kevin a ride home from work, and the two continue to catch up. You could tell that Chiron wants to open up, but is just not ready to be honest yet. When they arrive at Kevin's apartment, we see Chiron again by the ocean, where he will now be vulnerable again. We return to the final scene I showed in the beginning, where Kevin delivers the most important line in the movie, "Who is you?" While Chiron doesn't initially say much, Kevin gives us a lot of insight into his own struggle with identity. In this conversation, you realize that Kevin acknowledged where he went wrong and was able to fix himself and reform his identity. I think hearing this allows Chiron to be comfortable enough to talk about himself without any filters, and he does. Once Chiron opens up, Kevin realizes why he came here, for help. Chiron deep down still wants to find his true identity and be happy with himself, but he just needs someone to lean on. The final shot of the two depicts Chiron leaning on Kevin's shoulder. And I don't think this is implying that Chiron and Kevin are going to start a relationship. But at the very least, I think that this shows that Kevin could now be a guide for Chiron to help him accept who he is no matter what society has told him. So what is the main takeaway from this view into Chiron's life? I think that this can be said. You have a responsibility to choose who you are. It's extremely hard, and it is likely that society will try to force you to be something else. It is up to you to make that choice through your actions. However, if you make a mistake in the process, just know that there is a way to fix it. You just might have to reach out for some help. But remember, it's up to you. This has definitely been my favorite video to make. Not only did I understand more about this movie in the process of making this video, but I discovered something about myself. I truly love making videos like this and talking about topics like these. As I said in the beginning, there is much more about this movie that I didn't talk about and left out, so expect it to pop up again in future videos. Also, I feel like I can talk about identity more, maybe through discussing my own life, so expect a part 2 of this topic in the future. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Thank you.
I gotta get you home, little man.